Many of my patients are still asking, where did COVID-19 come from? Simply put, in most cases, new viruses come from old viruses. But if I stop there, that would make this video very short, so here's a slightly longer explanation. New Year's Eve 2019, the health officials in China admitted there was a new type of infection leading to pneumonia and the more serious complication, acute respiratory distress syndrome. They admitted only after a post by Dr. Li Wenlian. It's likely the infection he wrote about infected the first person in mid-November 2019. Unfortunately, this great hero later died of the infection himself. The seriousness of the virus was initially downplayed with the idea that if they only closed the wet market where it originated, its spread would be stopped. Instead, not stopping travel from its origin in the very beginning, it started to spread internationally. They named it SARS-CoV-2, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. But the question is, why the number 2? Well, that's because it is genetically similar to the SARS coronavirus from 2002. This is in the same family of viruses that cause the common cold, and the name is due to the crown-like spikes on its surfaces. Now, these same spikes are called S proteins, and they bind to an ACE2 receptor, which is also important in cardiovascular and renal function. But we won't go into detail about that today. We'll do that in a later video. The original coronaviruses that causes colds was discovered in the 1960s and are typically benign. In other words, all of us have had coronavirus infections in the past, but this one does not cause the common cold. It's more serious than that. The origin of this version of the coronavirus was from animals in the wet markets of Wuhan, China. It was reported that 27 out of the 41 that initially got sick from this virus had been to that market recently. So you may be asking, are there other viruses that come from animals that eventually infect humans? And the answer is yes. If we think about our past, the Spanish flu in 1918 possibly came from chicken. The swine flu, for obvious reasons, came from pigs and possibly even birds as well. HIV, as you may recall, was thought to come from chimpanzees. The SARS virus just mentioned came from a little rodent-looking creature called a civet. And the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, came from camels. And we all recall Ebola, which was really scary, and they think that came from bats. So COVID-19 was also thought to come from bats, which the virus probably mutated and eventually infected another animal called a pangolin, which is kind of a cross between an anteater and an armadillo. And again, once it got into that animal, the virus probably mutated again to attach to humans. One thing I wanted to mention is something called R0s, which describe how infectious a virus can be, or any other infection. COVID-19 is more contagious because it has an R0 value of 2.2 versus a flu infection, which has an R0 value of 1.3. Now, what this means is that COVID-19 will spread from one person to 2.2 additional people. And imagine those 2.2 people spreading to 2.2, and it just grows and grows, where the flu only spreads to 1.3 persons, which is still not great, but it's nothing compared to coronavirus. But before I continue, let me give you an aside. Many rumors have been out there stating that COVID-19 virus was man-made. Scientists have already investigated this claim and have found that the binding ability of the spike or S proteins I mentioned earlier of coronavirus are so strong that it had to be due to natural selection, which is a biological process, and not some man-made process or genetic engineering. Instead, it resembled the coronaviruses that already existed in those bats and the pangolin I mentioned earlier, and they probably just mutated. So those rumors you can pretty much discount at this point. Logically, it makes sense that humans would come in contact with birds and pigs, but how in the world do we get in contact with these wild animals like chimpanzees and bats and things of that nature? The answer is that the wet markets in China are known worldwide to have exotic animals that are not typical in other markets in the rest of the world. Not only do you have animals that are exotic there, exposing humans to viruses they don't normally see, but they are stacked on top of each other, the potential to cause infection in the other animals that they are nearby, including the very humans that are handling them. In fact, you may not believe this, but many of these exotic animals are slaughtered literally in the markets where they're being sold. Why did China allow this dating back to 1978? Well, it's because the government was not able to feed all the people, and they went through a period where a lot of starvation occurred. This resulted in private farming, where the small farmers were allowed to raise or capture more exotic animals to feed themselves or to sell to others. Believe it or not, these animals included bears, snakes, and of course bats. Even tigers were sold there. I do have good news. The selling of exotic animals in wet markets is now on hold. The problem is that the wet markets are big business, and of course we need to make sure the folk in China are able to have food. So what we're hoping for is that the World Health Organization, the CDC, the National Centers for Infectious Disease, and other world organizations can come together and work with China so that both the people are being fed properly while also finding a way to reduce the risk of wet markets. This will be needed if we hope to get this current pandemic under control, and of course to prevent other outbreaks in the future. So I want to thank each and every one of you for watching this video, but keep in mind that the content in this video is for informational purposes only and not considered medical advice. My hope, however, is to provide some clarity related to the topic discussed. And make sure to share this video with anyone you know who still has questions about the cause of COVID-19. But don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell so as I come up with more health related topics, you'll be the first to hear those topics as well.